no strangers to AR. BC Biermann and Iorio will be talking about ethics, right? We can spend some time in VR. Why should we do that? Should we do that? What are some implications? So, hand it off to you guys. You guys good to go?
Good to go. Thanks.
Yep.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm Iorio. I'm the Director of Innovation for the IEEE Standards Association. And
BC Biermann, a fellow at USC Annenberg Innovation Lab and also founder of the Heavy Projects.
We have a lot to squeeze into 15 minutes today, so I doubt that that's going to happen. But one of the visions that I think a lot of us are starting to appreciate is where a lot of these technologies are going to converge over the next generation and what form they'll take. When you combine mixed reality with artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, big data, and so forth, a lot of the talked about technologies now, as they converge over the next generation, I can envision an urban space, for example, that comes alive, that where what we currently call AR becomes a means of inserting curated content in real time into the built space, the built environment, into basically everything that we physically perceive. As that happens, there are some concerns with echo chambers, the filter bubble that's been referred to with regard to the internet. But this is different. I think this becomes qualitatively different as we achieve full immersion. We're used to dealing with content, well, a lot of us are used to dealing with content in headsets, but in general, the population is used to dealing with content that's clearly framed. It's on a monitor, it's explicitly separate from us. And I think that immersion tends to blur that distinction after a period where there is no frame, there is no inside and outside, there is no distinguishing characteristic between us and the content. So over time, especially when it's informed by AI that's constantly trying to anticipate your desires and needs, that we run the danger over the next generation of having our desires confirmed, having friction eliminated from our lives, and eliminating a lot of the things that we don't think are important, but in fact probably are for human well-being, for the good of society, for learning, for our individual and collective evolution. So one of the axes I think that we need to look at is immersion, is that it becomes qualitatively different once we are immersed in the content, once we become part of it, once the environment becomes sensate, once it responds to us as though we're an organism, so that the environment becomes less of an inner collection of structures and really becomes a sort of liquid extension of our own minds. There's another axis, which is, I guess you could call the mediation distance, something like that, between the digital object and the brain. Let's say we had a scale, just hypothetically. Let's say a computer monitor is a 1 on that scale. It's detached, it's distinct from us. We can get emotionally involved, but we can always just push a button and turn it off. 0 becomes with, let's say, advanced digital eyewear, so that you can technically still separate yourself from it, but and you still can manifest free will, you can make your own decisions and so forth, but the illusion becomes so compelling that it becomes more difficult. But I'm particularly fascinated by the less than 0, to reuse a phrase, where it becomes implanted, where it becomes part of our bodies. And at that point, what happens to free will? What happens to, can you really be a good person if you're not allowed to be a bad person? What happens to morality and individual judgments when, in fact, the the content and the hardware become a part of you. I think that it's not just a matter of degree, and for a long time I thought of it as a matter of degree, but I think at this point we're talking about a qualitative difference when we achieve that less than zero state of implants and so forth, and when the illusion becomes complete. You want to pick up on this?
Well, first of all, I love that. So yeah, I think what Jay has already said so eloquently that I can maybe add to a little bit, which is this, the concept of that these things are artificially siloed now, right? We actually, when this conference first started out 8 years ago, it's really sort of exclusively dedicated to augmented reality. And then over time, VR was added into the mix. Now we're talking about AI in this sort of this technology set of mixed reality. Even on the standard side, a lot of these standards overlap and they seem artificial. So we're talking about these now in a bit of a siloed frame, but over time, we're seeing these things converge, right? So these technologies will converge and sort of become a part of the air that we breathe. So what we have now, and I think Jay and I have seen what we're talking about this morning, was we have a moment. It's hard to understand a moment while you're living in it, but I think we're in it now in the sense that we need to have these public, discourse, these discussions about the trajectory of the technologies before they sort of fade into the distance and we're no longer talking about them in these terms, right? They're part of the air we breathe. We just accept them as already is. So with regard to this notion of less than zero, we need to talk about AI as a data backbone, right? Deep learning in terms of it's learning a particular corpus, a body of information. What we're particularly interested in is the corpus as the body, the human body. Ultimately, that's the telos of these things. It's hard to understand these technologies if you don't contextualize them in terms of their ends. I'm a developer as well as an academic and a digital artist, and sometimes I get lost in problem solving. I get lost in the technologies, that for a reason. The brain needs to hyper-focus on one thing to figure it out. But there's a need in these moments to step back from what you're doing and reassess and reevaluate. What is the telos? What are the ends of these things? Why are we doing what we're doing, and where are they going to end up? It's difficult to predict, but I think we can push the ship, even if a little bit, in a trajectory that maybe considers the common good as well as individual interests and the profit motive. Okay, so this notion of, I think, persuasion and manipulation is one that we need to touch on a little bit in terms of what Jay has just framed, is that we, in any society, the good citizen is sort of educated to be a good citizen in that culture. In the US, it tends to be the good consumer citizen. So for all of the positive ends that I think excite us about these technologies, and I still am very excited about these, especially AR, that's why I got into this, to democratize public spaces. But as AI starts to push out contextualized real-time data into public spaces, that can be both helpful in terms of biometric data, but also manipulative. If I'm choosing a restaurant based on my cholesterol count, or I'm choosing a restaurant from an AR front end that's pushing me data based on a profit-making motive, those are two completely different verticals and need to be addressed separately. So that's something that I think we're both interested in, is this notion of how specifically AI and AR get tied together, how one becomes a visible representation of front end for another. A second concept, and I'll just touch it on briefly, is this notion of the digital mirror. We're presenting sort of an illusion of diversity and choice with some of these technologies. The closest I can come, at least at this point, is an acoustic example, which is Pandora. I love Pandora. But there's sort of an illusion of diversity and choice in Pandora, is there not? I think the first time you use Pandora is actually the most diverse it'll ever be. The more you input, the more it encases itself around you in sort of your tastes. That can be an early precursor and analog to what we're sort of envisioning real-time in our case, like public urban spaces, as AR becomes this sort of mirror, a potential mirror for just our interests. If I don't want to see any unsanitary things on a public space, maybe AR can overlay that or change that for me. The problem with this sort of digital mirror concept is that it stunts or can stunt an essential human quality, which is growth, right? Some growth or much growth comes from friction. And we see a lack of friction in these technologies as opposed to just providing us the candy or the sugar that we want. And I think maybe Jay also has some salient thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, it's hard to sell people products that are unpleasant but good for them. I don't know what the business model for that would be. And that's sort of the central paradox here, is that left to its own devices, the marketplace will do what the customer wants, which is to have a more pleasant experience. You know, it would be hard to imagine an app that exposed me to harsh things that I would tend to want to avoid, just because it gives me the friction necessary to grow as a human. I'm not sure how you stop the headlong rush toward efficiency, comfort, and other characteristics that are not necessarily constructive in a way. There's the whole thing of the throwing the frog into the boiling water. One project that we're working on that is designed to throw the public into the boiling water and have them respond is mocking up a part of a city to incorporate all these technologies as they might be, let's say, a generation from now. You know, we will accept anything basically if it comes day by day. Encroachments, especially if they're in the guise of convenience or efficiency or friction-free living. You can see it in the places that over the last 100 years people have chosen to move. They tend to move to more segregated places, gated communities. People, given the resources, often tend to remove friction from their lives. And I'm concerned about the long-term effect of that. It could lead to a lack of tolerance for any sort of deviation, any eccentricity. Artists and inventors become inherently hostile to the society because they're deliberately trying to make you uncomfortable. They're trying to shake things up. Basically, all of the things that humans have evolved, the arts, for example, to challenge us, could easily become denatured in an environment like that. And subverted. So I would love to see a situation where people are thrown right into this environment to see how cool it is and to see all the remarkable, I mean, the reason that we're here is because this is unprecedented technology. And it really can change people's lives for the better in remarkable ways. But with that power comes a dark side. And the challenge I would propose to developers is, and you'll get into this, but is to try to wrestle with that paradox and find some way that during the development phase, these factors can be taken into consideration so that we end up with products that are constructive and don't start eating away at the foundation of this beautiful mansion that we've built on top.
Yeah, and let me just add on top of that quickly, we only have 2 more minutes, is that look, I'm preaching to myself here as well as, you know, the instant gratification of liking something or not liking something and having that thing immediately go away is a bit problematic, and it becomes exacerbated the more immersive it becomes. You know, it takes time to wrestle with a piece of art or a longer argument, an academic argument, a novel. And maybe, I don't think I'm alone in this room here, is that attention spans, those neural networks fail to get formed when we have this sort of immediate, I don't like it, it needs to go away, you know, instantly type of reaction to everything digitally that's confronting us. So, and I think we can sort of wrap this up with, you know, a call to this community, the developers, the engineers, the stakeholders, the people on the business side, is to at least think both short-term but also long-term, right? How are these things going to be used in the immediate sense, but also what's the social impact? How do we assess that social impact over the long haul? I think, frankly, there's a business model in that in terms of the longer-term thinking around these technology sets. And then also, There is an initiative ongoing right now, so let me pump that initiative, which is the Ethically Aligned Design Initiative within the IEEE. Jay and I would be happy to chat more about that after the session. We sit on the Mixed Reality Committee. All right.
All right, I think that's it.
Thank you, guys.
I would take them up on that offer. I think there's a huge discussion, as you guys said. It's difficult to predict, but let's start thinking about that now so that we know when this comes out, we can kind of be a little more prepared, right? I love that analogy. At 1 is the screen, at 0, contacts, is there less than 0? So very cool. Thank you, BC and Jay. Thanks again.